The night was quiet in the billionaire's estate, too quiet. Expensive glass walls reflected the moonlight, security cameras blinked red, and inside, marble floors held the echoes of a woman's trembling footsteps. Her name was Clara Johnson, a maid who had scrubbed those very floors for 8 years. She moved with the kind of precision only desperation teaches. In her hand a small leather bag, inside, $500,000 in untraceable cash. She hadn't stolen it for greed. She hadn't stolen it for revenge. She had stolen it for her daughter. 12-year-old Maya was lying in a hospital bed across town, tubes in her arms, her fragile chest rising and falling with the help of machines. A rare condition was shutting down her organs one by one. The doctors had told Clara the truth with a sterile bluntness. Without the surgery, without that money, your daughter has days, maybe hours. And that sups when Clara broke. She knew the billionaire Mr. Richard Holloway would never notice the missing cash immediately. His empire ran on billions. For Clara though, every cent meant the chance for Maya to breathe again. But here's where the story twists. Because what Richard Holloway did when he discovered her theft shocked everyone. Let's pause for a moment. This isn't just a story about theft. It's about systems of power, survival, and the quiet brilliance hidden in ordinary people. When someone is cornered by life, what choices remain? Clara didn't know it yet, but this single act, this one desperate grab for hope would flip her entire world upside down. She thought she had stolen from a billionaire, but in truth, she had set off a chain of events that would expose him, test her spirit, and force both of them into a moral reckoning neither had prepared for. Now, picture the moment after she slipped out the back door. Her heart raced as she gripped the steering wheel of her battered sedan, whispering her daughter Sip's name like a prayer. Hold on, Maya, hold on. But across town, in a penthouse office lined with golden glass, Richard Holloway sat awake, staring at security footage with narrowed eyes. He had seen her. The maid he had trusted to serve quietly in the shadows had just crossed a line no one dared. Instead of rage, however, something more dangerous stirred in him. Curiosity. And that right there is where the real story begins. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes, a single action can ignite a transformation far bigger than the person who took it. Clara thought she was just trying to save her daughter. She didn't yet realize she had also cracked open the mask of a billionaire who had secrets of his own. Before that night of stolen cash and heavy choices, Clara Johnson's life was a quiet string of sacrifices. She had grown up in the same city where the Holloway estate cast its shadow, but on the other side where sidewalks cracked, grocery stores had more lottery tickets than fresh fruit, and dreams were something you borrowed for a weekend, not something you owned. Clara was the kind of woman people described as reliable. Never missed a shift, never raised her voice, always polite, even when politeness meant swallowing disrespect whole. 8 years earlier, she had been hired by the Holloways. The offer seemed like a blessing: steady pay, health insurance at least for herself, and the promise of job security in a world where the rent always came too soon. But the estate was a different planet. Chandeliers, larger than her apartment, closets the size of her bedroom, wine that cost more than her monthly salary. And yet, even in such abundance, Clara noticed something: the casual blindness of wealth. It started subtly. Mrs. Holloway once complained about the caterer's too small portions, while Clara stood 2 feet away, knowing she'd have to stretch a can of beans for dinner. Richard himself would discuss million-dollar deals in front of her as if she were invisible, like a painting hung in the background. For years, Clara swallowed these moments, because she had Maya. Maya, the little girl who drew flowers on scraps of paper, who laughed at her own knock-knock jokes, who hugged Clara so tightly it felt like her arms could anchor her to life itself. Then came the diagnosis. A rare degenerative condition, the kind of illness insurance companies called pre-existing just to avoid paying for it. Clara's coverage didn't touch pediatric surgery. Medicaid had waiting lists so long they might as well have been brick walls. She tried everything. Fundraisers at church. Applying for charity medical programs. Begging hospital administrators. Each time the answer was the same: no. And the hospital bills kept piling, higher than the chandelier crystals she dusted every Tuesday in the Holloway dining room. One evening, after her shift, Clara stayed late to finish polishing the study's bookshelves. That's when she overheard Richard Holloway, on the phone, speaking casually, laughing about moving $500,000 into an offshore account to dodge taxes. $500,000. She stood there, holding a rag in her trembling hand, thinking about how that exact number could buy her daughter a chance to live. She didn't know it yet, but that was the seed of the moment. She would later break the rules. The injustice wasn't just about money, it was about power. This is something we see in real life too, when people at the top treat life-saving resources as disposable, while those at the bottom are told to be patient or grateful. It's not greed that pushes someone like Clara to act. It's the crushing weight of systems designed to keep the rich insulated and the desperate invisible. And that's what pushed her to her breaking point. By the time the hospital called to say Maya's condition had worsened, Clara's mind was already circling the possibility she'd once thought unthinkable. Here sits what that moment teaches us. When the world corners you, morality stops being a clean equation. The question becomes, what are you willing to risk for someone you love? The safe was never supposed to be open. Clara knew the code only because she had once been asked to dust inside it while Mrs. Halloway supervised. She'd memorized it without trying, a habit born from years of paying attention in a world that didn't notice her. It was a Thursday evening. The estate was quiet. The family had left for a charity gala, the kind where people in gowns pledged millions for causes they'd never visit, while children like Maya lay in underfunded hospitals. The office smelled faintly of cedar and leather. Clara stood in front of the safe, its thick steel door cracked open like an invitation or a dare. Inside, stacks of neatly banded $100 bills, $500,000 in cash, just as she'd overheard. She reached out, then stopped. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished metal, a maid's uniform, weary eyes, trembling hands. Here's the truth about moral decisions in moments like this. They're rarely clean, and they never happen in slow motion. They happen fast, faster than the mind can list every consequence, but the weight of them lasts forever. Her brain became a courtroom. The prosecution, this is theft. You'll be caught. You could lose your job, your freedom. The defense, your daughter will die without this. You've tried every legal road, no one helped. And then came the quieter, more dangerous voice. They won't even notice it's gone. She thought about the years she had given them, wiping fingerprints off crystal glass, scrubbing mud from imported rugs, clearing champagne bottles after parties where guests laughed too loud about stock market gains. She thought about how she'd been invisible in this house, until now. And she thought about Maya Sip's small hand in hers, the way her daughter Sip's voice had weakened in recent weeks. Mommy, when I get better, can we go to the beach? That memory tipped the scales. She slid the bills into the leather bag she'd brought for polishing supplies. It wasn't graceful, her hands shook, the room seemed to shrink around her. One last glance at the safe. She closed it, spun the dial, erased her fingerprints from the handle. Years of cleaning had made her an expert in disappearing traces. Walking through the hallway, she caught her reflection again in a mirror. This time, her eyes looked different, not just afraid, but resolved. In behavioral psychology, they call this the point of no return, the moment when the decision becomes part of you. Clara didn't just cross a legal boundary that night, she crossed a psychological one. Here sits what that moment teaches us. We often imagine morality as fixed, but under enough pressure, survival becomes the only moral compass, and survival has its own rules. By the time she reached her car, the bag of money beside her, the air felt heavier. The city lights blurred as she drove toward the hospital. She didn't know it yet, but she had just stepped into a game far bigger than herself. A game where the opponent wasn't just the billionaire, it was the system he thrived in. For most of her life, Clara had been underestimated. That was her hidden advantage. People assumed that being a maid meant being uneducated, unambitious, and powerless. They didn't know that before Maya was born, Clara had been top of her class in accounting at the local community college. She'd even been offered a junior auditor position at a mid-sized firm, until pregnancy, hospital bills, and a layoff pushed her into whatever work she could find. Over the years, she had quietly observed how wealth moved. She'd listened while Mr. Halloway talked to investors, read the papers he left lying around, even memorized the patterns of his business trips. She never planned to use that knowledge, until now. 2 days after taking the money, Clara sat beside Maya's hospital bed, pretending to read a magazine while her mind ran numbers. She had already paid the surgical deposit in cash, no questions asked, but she knew Halloway's reaction was coming. And when it came, she would need more than innocence to survive. Her first move was to cover her tracks. She timed her hospital visits to coincide with shifts at the estate that she'd called in sick for, using a voice hoarse from exhaustion, to leave messages for the house manager. She stored the rest of the cash in 3 separate safety deposit boxes under aliases she'd created, using information she'd pieced together from overheard conversations and discarded mail. Most people in her position would have hidden the money in a single place, but Clara understood one truth about risk: never let one locked door hold all you value. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Halloway wasn't acting like the victim of a theft. He was acting like a man playing chess. He hadn't called the police, not yet. Instead, he quietly pulled financial reports from his office, reviewed recent footage, and asked his head of security to tighten the perimeter. He wanted to see what Clara would do next before making his move. Back in the hospital room, Maya's color was returning. The surgery was scheduled. Clara's relief was real, but it was threaded with tension. She didn't know Holloway's full intentions, but she did know this powerful man rarely stayed silent without a reason. That's when she decided something that shifted the balance. If Holloway came for her, she wouldn't just defend herself, she'd use what she knew about him. Here's the hidden brilliance. Clara had kept a small notebook over the years. At first it was just to remember grocery lists and shifts, but soon it became something more, a record of overheard deals, whispered arguments, and suspicious instructions to staff, dates, times, names, even a note about that offshore transfer. She hadn't realized she was building leverage, now she did. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes the power we think we lack is already in our hands. It just hasn't been tested yet. Claire's years of invisibility had made her an observer. An observation, when coupled with memory, can be the sharpest weapon in a fight for survival. She didn't yet know how she would use the notebook, but she knew this: she would never be the same woman who scrubbed floors with her head down. And when the billionaire finally made his move, she would be ready. It happened on a Wednesday morning. Clara was halfway through her second cup of burnt hospital coffee when the nurse walked in, not with medical news, but with an envelope. It was from Child Protective Services. Inside was a notice. An anonymous tip had been filed claiming Clara was financially unstable and unable to provide a safe environment for Maya after surgery. The letter mentioned concerns about the sudden influx of cash. Clara's stomach dropped. This wasn't Sit's coincidence. She knew exactly who had made the call. Richard Holloway didn't need police to hurt her. He knew the system well enough to weaponize it. A criminal record could be fought in court, but a CPS investigation could take her child away before she even had the chance. This was psychological warfare. That same afternoon, 2 social workers arrived at the hospital room. Their questions were polite, but their eyes scanned every corner of the space. Where did the money for the surgery come from? Do you have proof of employment? Have you ever been involved in criminal activity? Clara answered steadily, but each question felt like a needle pushing closer to the truth. She could see Maya watching from the bed, confusion shadowing her eyes. When the visit ended, Clara excused herself to the hallway, leaned against the cold wall, and fought back the urge to crumble. This is what systemic obstacles look like. They don't always come as locked doors. Sometimes they come as official forms, polite smiles, and procedures that strip you of your dignity while insisting they were just doing their job. 2 days later, the hospital billing office called. Her payment had been flagged as potentially illicit, and unless she could prove the source of funds, they would temporarily halt her daughter's surgery. It was all happening at once. Her motherhood, her child's life, her sanity, caught in a tightening noose of bureaucracy and silent accusations. That night, sitting alone in her car in the hospital parking lot, Clara let herself cry for the first time since the theft. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. She had outsmarted the safe. She had planned for police. She had even hidden the cash, but she hadn't planned for this being attacked through the very systems meant to protect children. Here sits what that moment teaches us. When power is threatened, it rarely strikes where you expect. It doesn't always confront you head-on. It goes for the softest, most vulnerable part of your life. And if you're not ready, it will break you there. For the first time, Clara questioned whether she could win. She imagined losing Maya not to illness, but to a system that would place her in foster care while Clara sat powerless. That fear burned deeper than anything else. And fear, in moments like this, can either paralyze you or sharpen you into something unrecognizable. Clara didn't meet her mentor in an office or a classroom. She met her in the hospital cafeteria, over reheated soup and the low hum of vending machines. The woman's name was Angela Morris, a retired social worker who now volunteered as a patient advocate. She'd been visiting another child on the pediatric floor when she noticed Clara's tense posture and red-rimmed eyes. Angela had a gift for reading people. She sat across from Clara without asking, as if she'd been invited, and simply said, "They're trying to take something from you, aren't they?" Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Over the next hour, Angela really listened, as Clara explained everything in guarded half-confessions. She didn't reveal the theft, but she made it clear she had found the money through unconventional means. Angela didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned in and said something Clara hadn't heard from anyone in weeks. "Then stop letting them dictate the narrative. You know more than you think." Angela explained the reality. CPS, hospital administrators, and even billionaires, all operated within systems, and systems could be navigated, redirected, even turned against themselves. She told Clara something that became the foundation of her comeback. In every fight, there sits the story they're telling about you, and the story you tell about yourself. Only one of those will survive. That night, Clara opened her old notebook. But instead of just reading her entries, she began organizing them, dates in one column, people in another, actions and motives in a third. She wasn't just a desperate mother anymore, she was building a case. She started documenting everything with precision. Every visit from CPS. Every delay from the hospital. Every conversation, no matter how small. And she began quietly asking questions of nurses, security staff, even the house manager at the estate, questions that seemed casual but pulled at loose threads. Angela taught her another rule: never play your strongest card first. Make them think you stir folding while you stir actually setting the trap. So Clara kept her voice calm in every official meeting, nodding along, never showing the steel that was forming inside her. Meanwhile, she began discreetly leaking small, true stories to a local community blog, stories about wealthy families avoiding taxes, about hospitals freezing treatment over billing irregularities. She left names out for now. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Transformation doesn't always come with loud declarations or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it begins in silence, in the patient, deliberate preparation for the moment you'll strike. By the end of the week, something in Clara had shifted. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. She had a plan, and it wasn't just about saving Maya anymore. It was about making sure no one else could use the system the way Holloway had used it against her. Clara's first moves were so small, they looked like nothing at all. That was intentional. She knew from Angela's advice that the most effective strategy wasn't a frontal attack. It was erosion, quiet, steady, and invisible until it was too late to stop. Step 1. She made herself appear cooperative. Every CPS visit was met with calm compliance. Paperwork was filled out neatly. Questions were answered without hesitation. She even offered them coffee, smiling in a way that made them think she had nothing to hide. But behind that smile, she was gathering every inspector's name, every case note, every contradiction in their reports. Step 2. She began to seed doubt, not in the system but in the people working within it. A casual conversation with a nurse turned into a question about hospital policy. Isn't it unusual to delay a surgery after payment sit's been made? I just want to understand the rules. The nurse, unaware of the full situation, confirmed that yes, it was unusual. Clara wrote it down. A short chat with the billing clerk revealed something else. A special review on her payment had been initiated by an outside inquiry. Clara didn't ask who. She already knew. Step 3. She tightened her alliances. Angela introduced her to a contact at a small but respected legal aid organization. Clara didn't reveal the theft, but she laid out the harassment pattern: CPS calls, payment freezes and delays. The lawyer didn't promise miracles, but she did something even more valuable. She told Clara what records to request, what phrases to use in emails to trigger legal obligations, and how to make her paper trail bulletproof. Meanwhile, Richard Holloway was watching. Through his private investigator, he knew Clara hadn't spent lavishly or fled town. To him that meant she was scared. That was his mistake. Because while he believed she was simply holding her breath, Clara was actually digging under the walls. The first subtle win came a week later. The hospital, faced with legal inquiries from the aid organization, suddenly resolved the payment issue. Maya's surgery was rescheduled, quietly with no apology. Clara said nothing. She let them think they were doing her a favor. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Power often assumes it can see every move you're making, but the most dangerous strategy is to make them look in the wrong direction while you prepare the real strike. As the days passed, she continued to build her leverage. Each interaction added to the mosaic fragments of truth about Holloway's finances, whispers from former employees, details from contractors, about off-the-books projects. She still hadn't used her notebook, but it was no longer just a record, it was becoming a weapon. And yet Clara knew one thing: the moment she went public there would be no turning back. That moment had to be chosen carefully, timed for maximum effect. She could feel it coming. Like a storm gathering beyond the horizon, there was a shift in the air. Something was about to break. The reversal didn't come in a courtroom. It came in a ballroom. 2 weeks after Maya's surgery, Richard Holloway hosted his annual Holloway Foundation Gala, a night where the city's elite congratulated themselves for their philanthropy. Journalists, donors, and local officials filled the chandeliers and crystal space. Clara had no invitation, but she had a plan. Angela's network had quietly connected her with a journalist from an investigative outlet. Clara had handed over copies of her notebook. Every date, every conversation, every detail about Holloway's offshore accounts, his tax evasions, and his quiet influence over hospital decision-making. The reporter had verified enough to publish a bombshell expose, timed for release exactly 1 hour into the gala, when the press was already watching Holloway for photo ops. The first alert went off on a journalist test's phone, then another, and another. Within minutes, the headline was everywhere. Local billionaire accused of financial misconduct, charitable fraud and manipulation of medical systems. Screens lit up in the ballroom, conversations stalled, and the cameras turned. Holloway Sipp's smile froze as a reporter called out across the crowd. "Mr. Holloway, how do you respond to allegations you delayed a child Sipp's life-saving surgery for personal retaliation?" Gasps rippled through the room, guests shifted in their seats. The mayor, seated at Holloway's table, suddenly found a reason to check her phone. Clara wasn't in the room to see his face, but she didn't need to be. She was watching from her kitchen table, Maya beside her, both of them bathed in the glow of the television as the news broke in real time. The footage showed Holloway trying to dismiss the questions, calling the accusations baseless, but his voice wavered. He knew the worst part wasn't the journalists. It was the sudden silence of donors pulling their hands from his arm. By the next morning, the story had spread nationally. Former employees began contacting the press with their own accounts. Community leaders demanded investigations. Holloway's PR team went into crisis mode, but the damage was already done. Clara had done in one night what no one else had in years, made him answer publicly for his power. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Sometimes, the win isn't just taking back what was stolen from you, it's forcing those who exploit others to stand under the same light they've avoided their whole lives. For the first time since this began, Clara felt the weight in her chest lift. She hadn't just saved her daughter, she had broken the shield that had protected Holloway for decades. But public victories are rarely the end of the story, and Clara knew there would be fallout, some of it good, some of it dangerous. The morning after the gala, the city felt different. News vans lined the street outside Holloway's corporate headquarters. His lawyers moved like shadows, slipping in and out of side entrances. Former allies issued carefully worded statements, each one designed to create distance. For the first time in years, Richard Holloway wasn't the one writing the story, he was the headline. The official investigation moved quickly. The leaked documents had triggered not just local scrutiny, but federal attention. Bank accounts were frozen. A tax fraud probe was opened, and whispers began that some of his charitable projects had been little more than laundering schemes. Inside the Holloway estate, the staff began to disappear, some quitting quietly, others subpoenaed for testimony. And then there was Clara. CPS dropped their case, citing insufficient evidence and no immediate risk to the child. The hospital sent an apologetic letter, carefully avoiding any admission of wrongdoing, but the surgery had been done, and Maya's recovery was steady. Clara could have stopped there. She could have gone back to her life, kept her head down, and counted herself lucky. But she didn't set. Angela had warned her, when you win like this, you have a responsibility. People will come to you hoping you can show them the way. And they did. Within weeks, other hospital patients, families who had been denied care or priced out of treatment, began reaching out to Clara. Some had stories of similar retaliation, others about hidden fees and sudden policy changes. Clara started meeting them in coffee shops, sharing the same advice Angela had given her. She wasn't just a maid anymore, she was becoming something else. An advocate, a strategist, a protector for people who didn't know how to fight back. As for Holloway, the empire he'd built on untouchability was fracturing. A year later he accepted a settlement deal to avoid a full trial, an agreement that stripped him of control over several companies and cost him millions in fines. His name still carried weight in certain circles, but it was no longer spoken with the same unquestioned reverence. And perhaps the most telling detail, the Holloway Foundation Gala was never held again. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Justice isn't always a clean victory, it's messy, it's costly, and it doesn't erase the harm. But when one person refuses to stay silent, the impact can ripple far beyond their own life. For Clara, the cost had been fear, sleepless nights, and the constant shadow of being exposed for the theft that started it all. But the gain was seeing her daughter take her first steps into a future she might not have had. A year after the night she opened the safe, Clara stood at a community center podium, her daughter sitting in the front row. The room wasn't filled with billionaires or polished marble. It was filled with folding chairs, warm coffee, and people who understood the weight of hard choices. She had been invited to speak at a local advocacy workshop about navigating systems of power. She almost said no. Public speaking wasn't her comfort zone, but when she looked at Maya healthier, stronger, she realized her story wasn't hers to keep. She didn't tell the audience every detail. She didn't confess to the theft. Instead, she told them about the systems she had faced, the moments she'd been underestimated, and the tools she'd used to fight back. She spoke slowly, deliberately, like someone handing over a map drawn from memory. She told them, "The world will try to define you by what you can do, what you don't have, or where you have come from. But there is always a choice, to let them write your story, or to write it yourself. Sometimes that choice is quiet, sometimes it sits dangerous, but it sits always yours. When she finished, the applause wasn't loud, it was steady, deliberate, like the beating of a drum, a rhythm that said we hear you. Afterward, people lined up to speak with her. Parents, young adults, even a retired nurse. Each one carried a piece of their own quiet battle, and each left with the reminder that power isn't always about position, it's about persistence. Angela, watching from the back of the room, smiled. This was the legacy, not the headlines, not the public scandal, but the chain of people who would now see themselves as something other than powerless. Here sits what that moment teaches us. Injustice can push you to the edge, but it can also awaken something unstoppable, if you're willing to act, to adapt, and to hold your ground when the powerful try to move you. Clara knew she'd never erase the night she took that money, but she had transformed it from an act of desperation into a lifetime of advocacy. And she knew something else somewhere. Right now another person was standing at their own fork in the road. Maybe they'd hear her story. Maybe it would give them the courage to take one more step forward. Final call to action to audience. If Clara's story resonates with you, if you've ever felt cornered, underestimated, or silenced, remember you are not without options, and you are not alone. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you value voices that speak truth to power, like, comment, and subscribe, because every time you do, these stories travel further, reaching the people who need them most. That closes Clara's arc, and leaves the audience with both emotional closure and a challenge to reflect on their own story.